As I mentioned yesterday, I was born and raised quite Jewish. My parents were both German Jewish Holocaust refugees. They had both fled Hitler's Germany. And growing up, I grew up in the 50s, so it was pretty shortly after the war. Jews and Gentiles, at least in the United States, I grew up outside of New York City. That's why I'm speaking too fast. I'll slow down. But there was less mingling between Jews and Gentiles, and Jews and Christians. And growing up, all my friends were Jewish. All my parents' friends were Jewish. There wasn't really much interaction with Christians. I went to a secular school, but from the beginning of school into university, I also went to Jewish religious education after school. And so my entire identity was Jewish growing up, and the only way I could even conceive of God and religion was through Judaism. In my late high school years, I became even more fanatically Jewish, one might say. I became a follower of a Hasidic rabbi. You know the Hasids with the long black coats and the ear curls? And I kind of fell under the spell of a very charismatic Hasidic rabbi and followed in his train and went to Israel the summer between high school and college, following him around and being at his prayer meetings every night and so forth. And I even thought of not coming back to the United States to begin university that fall, but just staying in Israel and entering the closest thing Judaism has to religious life, which is a life of study and prayer in yeshiva, in this case in Jerusalem. It's a fairly monastic form of life. It's not exactly the same. But I didn't. I went back to the United States and I started university, which was MIT, which is a very technical, scientific, secular spirit university. And it's also a very prestigious university, so of course, everyone there thinks that they're the smartest people in the world and know more than anyone else. And it was under that spell of that environment, I essentially lost my Jewish faith. The view of the world there was that religion is just some kind of, medieval superstition that man came up with to explain things before there was science to, really give the true explanation. And I fell under the sway of that pseudo-scientific worldview that science has all the answers and religion is just myth. It's actually a pseudo-scientific worldview. It's the opposite of scientific worldview. Because the essence of science is you start with the data, you start with the evidence, you develop a theory that can explain the evidence. If it successfully explains the evidence, you can hold on to that theory. And if it can't explain the evidence, you have to throw it away and come up with another theory. The truth is that all of the evidence points to the truths of the Catholic faith. You have tons and tons of materialistic, scientifically establishable evidence that supports Catholicism and that actually contradicts materialism. For instance, you have the Shroud of Turin. I think all of you know about the Shroud of Turin, Jesus' burial cloth. And even today, in 2015, with all of our technology, all of the engineers and scientists in the world could not counterfeit the Shroud of Turin, much less 800 years ago, whenever it first came to the surface. You have the Tilma of Guadalupe. Similarly, it's on this cactus fiber cloth that has a lifetime of 20 or 30 years, and it is completely, undamaged and unworn after almost 500 years, and so forth. You have the miracles of Fatima, right? The sun spinning in the sky and crashing to Earth, which was seen by 80,000 or 100,000 people, including skeptics, including communists, including atheists, who had only gone there to laugh at these superstitious peasants who thought there'd be a miracle. You have the medical miracles at Lourdes and so forth and so on, right? You're all aware of that. But if one truly had a scientific worldview, one would have to say the theory of materialism fails because there's evidence to contradict it. Does this make sense? So anyway, but of course I didn't know this then. But it's a little bit of a digression, but we live in this very scientifically oriented age. I think that God gave us these physical miracles, especially today, like the Shroud of Turin and so forth, in part as a means of evangelization. So I think it's an effective means of evangelization. In other words, if somebody wants to be totally materialistic and claim that that the faith is all nonsense, they should be challenged. Okay, how do you explain this? How do you explain this? And actually, all they can do is throw away the evidence. Basically, and Émile Zola, who was a very big French writer at the turn of the 20th century, an atheist, he went to Lourdes to write a book debunking Lourdes, showing how it was all just, imaginary. He went there. He saw tremendous physical miracles. There was a woman in the railway carriage going down with him whose face was eaten away by a cancer. And he saw her after she was healed, and she had a healthy face. Well, you know what his response was? Was to pension her off, I think it was in Belgium, for the rest of her life, so that nobody could see her. He wrote, "I don't care how many miracles I see, I refuse to believe them." So anyway, that's the position that's the scientific position. That's not very scientific. But anyway, I lost my faith at MIT. I went on to Harvard Business School. I did well enough at Harvard Business School to be invited to join the faculty. I joined the faculty, and at the ripe old age of 29, I was a professor of marketing at Harvard Business School, which was pretty heady stuff. But that's when the bottom fell out of my world, because what had been going on all my life since I was a small child was I felt in my heart there has to be a real meaning and purpose to life, and someday when I'm older, I'll come to know the real meaning and purpose to life, which I thought would come from entering into a personal relationship with God, which I honestly thought would happen at my bar mitzvah. The bar mitzvah is like the Jewish version of confirmation. When the child is about 13, he goes through this ceremony in the synagogue and enters religious adulthood. And I honestly thought that at my bar mitzvah, the veil would drop and I would come into a personal relationship with God. And when that didn't happen, it was actually one of the saddest days of my childhood. But then pretty soon I decided the real meaning and purpose of life would come when I got a driver's license. Or when I left home, or when I started university, or if I got into Harvard Business School, and so forth. So I had for about 10 or 15 years these external objects that I thought would give my life real meaning. But here at the point I'm describing, when I was 29, I was already far more successful in a worldly sense than I ever expected to be, being a professor at Harvard Business School, but life still had no meaning or purpose. We were just a chemical accident, some lightning hit some mud filled with amino acids, 5 billion years ago, and here we are. There's no meaning or purpose to life. We live for 70 or 80 or 90 years and die, and that's it. There's no pattern to things that happen, and so forth. So there was no point to anything despite the worldly success. But the difference being, at this point, there was nothing more I could look forward to that I could imagine would give life meaning, because there was no brass ring out there to still reach for. So I fell into the deepest despair of my life at that point, a kind of existential despair. And it was in that I was walking in nature early one morning, just lost in my thoughts. That's the only solace I found, would be to go to some beautiful place, in the middle of nature. So I was just walking along, and I had long since, I was essentially an atheist at that point. I had long since given up on any idea of God or religion. And I received the most spectacular grace in my life. As I was walking along from one moment to the next, the curtain between earth and heaven disappeared, and I found myself in the presence of God, very knowingly in the presence of God, in a very intimate conversation with God, so to speak, seeing my life and experiencing my life as I would see it after I died and looked back over it in the presence of God. And I saw instantaneously, I saw how I would feel about everything after I died. I saw that my two greatest regrets when I died would be, number one, all of the time and energy I had wasted worrying about not being loved, when every moment of my existence I was held in an ocean of love, greater than I ever imagined could exist, coming from this all-knowing, all-loving God. And the other regret would be every hour I had wasted doing nothing of value in the eyes of heaven. I saw my life as though all my life I had been greedily accumulating piles of Monopoly money, that brightly colored paper money from the game of Monopoly, when right next to it there was a stack of gold coins that I had been ignoring, which would be, of course, merit in heaven. I saw how foolish it was to be greedy for things that wouldn't be doing me any good at all, even 100 years hence, when I'm dead, whereas I could have been greedy, so to speak, to accumulate treasure in heaven, from which I would very literally be benefiting 100 million years from now. Now, I know this isn't the healthiest attitude in the world, but I was a Harvard Business School marketing professor, so I have an excuse. Everything was net present value, everything was maximizing returns, and I was still seeing this a little bit in that way. So I didn't see the error in being greedy, I just saw how stupidly greedy I had been. And if I want to be smart and greedy, the only thing that made sense would be to try to be as great a saint as possible, essentially. Another thing that I saw in this experience was how foolish I had been. I had basically spent my life sort of looking in the rearview mirror, saying to myself, if only that hadn't happened to me, then I would be happy today, or if only that hadn't happened to me, then I would be happy today. And nothing could be further from the truth, because everything that had ever happened to me had been the most perfectly designed thing that could come to meet me, coming from the hands of this all-knowing, all-loving God. Not only including those things that had caused the most suffering at the time, but especially those things that had caused the most suffering at the time. And of course, I saw that the meaning and purpose of my life was to worship and serve my Lord and God and Master who was revealing himself to me. Now, I will say one other thing. Probably the biggest single transformative aspect of this experience was just coming into the incredibly intimate knowledge that God not only knew me personally, not only knew my name, but had been watching over me and caring about me every moment of my existence from my conception, as though I were the only person he had ever created or ever would create. He not only knew and controlled everything that ever happened to me, but he knew how I felt at every moment of my life and cared about how I felt at every moment of my life. And in a fairly real way, was made happy by everything that made me happy, and was saddened with me by everything that made me sad. And it was coming into this understanding of how intimately God knew me and how intimately he loved me and cared about me every moment. That was by far the biggest transformative aspect of this. Now, one might ask, didn't you know that as a Jew? Now, in all honesty, if you read the Old Testament, that is not the picture of God you get. You get a little of it in the prophets, but you don't get any of it in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The picture you get of God is like the picture you see in Exodus, when God calls Moses up to the top of Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments. He tells him, build a fence around the base of the mountain before you come up, because if anyone should even touch the base of the mountain while I'm on top, they will have to be instantly killed because of the sacrilege. So that's kind of the picture I had of God. Obviously this was not fitting in with that picture. So I prayed. I could not think of this God as the God of Judaism, as the God of the Old Testament. So as I was having this experience, I was actually still walking. It's a very curious, needless to say, state that I was in, because I still saw the physical world around me, the trees and the bushes and the insects, but I saw through it into the spiritual world. And the spiritual world was so much realer and so much more immediate and so much more concrete and substantial than the physical world that I wasn't surprised during this experience that I was seeing the spiritual world. The only thing I couldn't understand is how I could have ever not seen it, because it was so much more real than the physical world, which was like, a painted veil, a kind of gossamer veil that was simply shielding one's vision from the real world. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but sometimes when you go to the theater or go to the ballet, you'll be in the audience and you'll be looking at the stage, and there'll be a curtain on the stage and the lights will be on, and you'll just see the front of the curtain. And then they will turn off the house lights and there'll be lights shining on the front of the curtain, and you'll still just see the curtain. but then they will dim those lights and turn on the stage lights. And all of a sudden you see through the curtain to the actors on the stage or the dancers on the stage, and you barely see the curtain anymore. And it was like that. It was like the physical world just became that, very thin veil behind which I saw the spiritual world. So I was walking along still, and I prayed to this God who was so incredibly present. Let me know your name so I know what religion to follow to worship and serve you properly. I don't mind if you're Buddha and I have to become a Buddhist. I don't mind if you're Krishna and I have to become Hindu. I don't mind if you're Apollo and I have to become a Roman pagan, as long as you're not Christ and I have to become Christian. And I very literally prayed that. And God respected that prayer, Christ respected that prayer, and he didn't tell me who he was. And I wasn't ready to hear it, obviously. But I went back home. Let me make a little bit of a digression that's a little bit related to the speakers yesterday morning, which is the picture that I have of the state that Jews are in with their resistance to Christ and their resistance to Christianity. Is sort of like the following, parable or metaphor or something. Imagine a little boy with a pet dog, and that dog just loves this little boy. The little boy is, the moon and the stars and the sun to this dog. The dog just like curls up under his chair all day waiting for him, to come to the table or whatever. And the dog lives for this little boy. And then the little boy goes off to school, and the dog is, incredibly mournful and inconsolable. And the little boy grows up, and he becomes like a teenager, and he comes back home. And he knocks on the door to come into the house, and the little dog is going nuts, barking at him and wants to tear him to pieces, because he thinks that little boy, that young man, is invading and taking the place of the little boy who he wants to stay loyal to. Does that make sense? And that's kind of the state that I feel like I was in as a Jew, because in a way the state that Jews are in is they're trying to stay loyal to Christ, actually, to Christ as he revealed himself in the Old Testament and in the days of, before he incarnated. And out of their loyalty to Christ, they're refusing to accept Christ. It makes sense, right? But anyway, that was all a digression. Back to the beach. So I came out of this experience slowly over a period of hours, a little bit, in another sense, over a period of days. I went back home to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I was living at the time, as a Harvard professor. I couldn't care at all about teaching Harvard MBAs how to make a little more money anymore. All I wanted to do was pursue this experience and learn who this God was and how to worship and serve him properly. So I did some stupid things during that year, because this had been a mystical experience, and so I looked into some various forms of mysticism, which were a very bad idea. But I did one smart thing, which is every night before going to sleep, I would say a short prayer that I had made up to learn the name of my Lord and Master and God who had revealed himself to me. I'd say this prayer just before going to sleep. And a year to the day after that initial experience, and I know it was a year to the day because I prayed in thanksgiving that day before going to sleep. A year to the day after that first experience, I went to sleep, and I thought I was awoken by a hand gently on my shoulder and led to a room and left alone with the most beautiful young woman I could ever imagine. And I knew without being told that it was the Blessed Virgin Mary. When I found myself in her presence, all I wanted to do was throw myself on my knees and somehow honor her appropriately. In fact, the first thought that crossed my mind was, oh my gosh, I wish I at least knew the Hail Mary, but I didn't. Now, I'll say a couple of things about that initial part of that experience. First of all, I now understand my body was asleep in bed. I thought I was awake at the time. My memory represents it as though I were awake. But I understand that if there had been a camera in the room, it would have shown me asleep in bed. But anyway, when I found myself in her presence, I was just overwhelmed, and actually lifted into a state of ecstasy simply by the love that flowed from her. And as beautiful as she was to look at, even more powerfully affecting was the sound of her voice. When she spoke, Her voice was like what makes music music. It was like the essence of music. And it carried with it a love that just flowed through all of my fibers and lifted me up into a state of ecstasy. And the first thing she said to me was she offered to answer any questions I might have for her. As I mentioned, my first thought when I was in her presence was I wish I at least knew the Hail Mary so I could honor her appropriately. So when she offered to answer any questions I might have for her, I kind of wanted to ask her to teach me the Hail Mary, but I was too proud to admit that I didn't know it. So as a kind of indirect way, I said, "What's your favorite prayer to you?" figuring she'd teach me the Hail Mary, right? Her first response was a little bit coy. It was, "I love all prayers" to me. But I was a little bit pushy. Maybe that's because I'm a New York Jew and maybe not. But I said, "But you must love some prayers to you more than others." And she relented and she recited a prayer, but it was in Portuguese and I didn't know any Portuguese. So all I could do was make the effort to remember the first few syllables phonetically, and the next morning when I woke up, I wrote them down phonetically, and then later when I met a Portuguese Catholic woman, I asked her to recite all of the Marian prayers in Portuguese so I could try to identify it, and to the best of my ability, I identified it as, "O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee." I'll mention maybe 3 or 4 of the other questions and answers. Most of the questions were simply expressions of, I don't know how to put it, of my response to her presence, which was, I'll go into the questions. It's hard to describe, but I was absolutely overwhelmed. I knew that she was a human being, a person during this experience, but she was so glorious and so magnificent and so exalted that it was really hard to hold on to that thought that she was a human being. And in my defense, I will say that we know from, I believe it's the letter of John, when an angel appeared to him, he threw himself on the ground and began to worship the angel until the angel said, "Get up, don't do that, that's not appropriate, I'm a creature like you." And we know that the Blessed Virgin Mary is the Queen of Angels. She's more exalted than the highest of the angels. So if that was the natural human response to an angel, how much more so to the Queen of Angels? So most of my questions came out of that. So one of the questions I asked her was, in this state, I kind of stammered out, "How is it possible? How can it be? How is it possible that you're so magnificent, that you're so exalted, that you're so glorious? How can it be?" And she just looked down on me almost pityingly, and she shook her head gently, and she said, "Oh no, you don't understand. You don't understand anything. I'm a creature. I'm a created thing. He's everything." And then another question I asked her, again out of this desire to somehow honor her appropriately, was I asked her what title she liked best for herself. And her response was, "I am the beloved daughter of the Father, mother of the Son, and spouse of the Spirit." And I will say that at the time I had this dream or this experience, I knew nothing about Christianity. I had never opened a New Testament, lest it pollute me. I knew absolutely nothing about the Blessed Virgin Mary except, from Christmas carols, Silent Night, and from seeing Christmas creches occasionally. All of this was entirely new to me. The last question and answer I think that I'll mention is, by now I figured out, obviously, that if this is the Blessed Virgin Mary, it had been Christ on the beach, and it's all about Christianity, and I'd better get up to speed pretty quick. And all my life I had heard the expression, the Holy Spirit, but I didn't know what it meant. So I asked her, and I apologized for the way I phrased it, but I didn't know any better. I said, "What's this business about the Holy Spirit?" And her response was simply to look upwards with an expression melting with love and say, "He's his gaze." Many years later, when I told this story to some seminarians, they pointed out that St. Thomas Aquinas had called the Holy Spirit the look of love that passes between the Father and the Son. So I think that's probably all the questions and answers that are worth recounting. I asked some stupid ones too. And then after I was finished with my questions, she said she had something she wanted to talk to me about, tell me. So she spoke for about another 10 or 15, maybe 20 minutes. And then the audience was over and I went back to sleep. And the next morning when I woke up, I knew that it had been Christ on the beach. I wanted nothing other. I knew who the Blessed Virgin Mary was. I knew her role, by the way, as a unique channel between heaven and earth. That I knew from the experience. And I knew I wanted to be as fully and completely a Christian as possible. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what the difference was between a Protestant and a Catholic. And so all I could really do was open a local phone book and go to a local church. It was a Protestant church. But I knew who the Blessed Virgin Mary was, and when I got to know the pastor a little bit, I kind of shyly asked, what about the Blessed Virgin Mary? And when he answered without the respect that I knew she deserved, I knew this is no place for me. And the other thing that was happening in those days was I was spending all of my free time hanging around Marian shrines. And there was a Marian shrine near my house to Our Lady of La Salette, which was an apparition in the French Alps in, I believe it was 1846. It's a little bit like Fatima to a couple of shepherd children, but it was a one-time apparition. And so there was a shrine to Our Lady of La Salette near my house, and I would drive up there 3 or 4 days a week just to walk the grounds and kind of commune with Mary. And of course, that was a Catholic shrine. And whenever I was at a Catholic shrine and there was a Mass going on, I was filled with this tremendous desire to receive communion, even though I didn't know what it was. It was almost like a lust, you know, I want that, I want that, I want that. So basically that's what led me to the Catholic Church pretty directly, was knowing who the Blessed Virgin Mary is and wanting to receive communion. I will tell one story along the path. You'll see why when I tell the story. So I had been hanging out at the shrine to La Salette. That winter, I went skiing in the French Alps, which was what I lived for, actually, before my conversion. And the place where I was skiing, it rained for a couple of days. The skiing was pretty bad. I looked on a map. It looked like it was only an hour or two from La Salette, the real La Salette in France, the place where the apparition occurred. So I figured I'd take a day off of skiing and drive there. So I did that. And by the time I got there, because of the mountain roads and so forth, it was the end of the day. It was sunset. La Salette is very high in the French Alps. It's miles and miles above the tree line. It is incredibly beautiful. It looks like Shangri-La. You leave the nearest village, you're winding, you know, the switchback road up the mountain. You leave the near last village, maybe about 10 kilometers behind. You leave the tree line. You know, it's all granite cliffs and snow bowls. And then when you get almost to the top of the mountain, there's a little hollow with this basilica. Incredibly beautiful. So I get to it. It's almost sundown. And I go in there and I ask, I see a sign saying reception. So I go in there and I ask if it's possible to stay there. And they said, sure. So I stay there. I got stuck there for the whole ski trip because a blizzard moved in. The rain that was raining at the ski area was snow there. A blizzard moved in. I got stuck there for about 10 days. And but those 10 days, the Blessed Virgin Mary was working on me, essentially. I mean, I know that. I was sleeping most of the time. I had these very beautiful, delicious dreams and so forth. And then on my way back to the United States, finally the blizzard lifted just in time for me to drive off the mountain. I was flying home from Geneva. I'm staying at a friend's apartment in Geneva, waiting for my flight the next morning. And I go to sleep, and just before going to sleep, I say a prayer, which is just complaining to God, as so many of our prayers are. And I say, I can't believe you did this to me. I go halfway around the world to go skiing, and you stick me at La Salette the whole time, you know. And after that, I fall asleep, and I wake into a dream where I'm confronted with this very serious, somber man, but you could tell, you know, what he reminded me of is like the high school teacher who is always very serious, but the kids know that he actually loves them more than all of the clappy, happy teachers. So this very serious but loving man just is in front of me. He drills me with his eyes, and he says, you can go skiing, or you can work for the second coming. It's your choice. Which do you choose? So anyway, so then I go home, and when I was dying to find someone to talk to about my mystical experiences. When I was at La Salette, there was another pilgrim there, an elderly French woman. And after I got home, she called me up and she said, we think it would be a good idea if you check out the Carthusians. And I knew nothing about the Carthusians. I don't know how many of you know about the Carthusians. Have any of you seen the movie Into Great Silence? But the Carthusians are the strictest contemplative order in the church. They live in solitary confinement, essentially. They live in very strict silence. One meal a day that's brought to them in a kind of dumbwaiter, so they don't even see the person who brings it to them. They're not allowed to talk at all. They break sleep every night. They sleep for about 3 hours from 9 to midnight, and then they get up to chant matins until about 2:30 in the morning, and then they get to sleep about another 3 hours until they get up for Mass. Very severe, silent, beautiful contemplative order. But I didn't know much of this, so she gives me the phone number of a Carthusian monastery near where she lives in France, and I call them up, and I say, can I come and visit? Because when I heard about the Carthusians, I thought, if anyone's a mystic, these guys better be mystics, or else they'd be going nuts with such a, penitential life. So anyway, the guy who answers the phone, he answered the phone, it turns out, because he was the prior. When I said, can I come and stay for a little while? He said, no, absolutely not. We're strictly cloistered. We don't receive any visitors. But then he says, tell me something about yourself. So I start telling him the story, and I can hear he's beginning to waver. So I say, should I send you a letter? And he said, good idea, send me a letter. So I send him a letter, and he immediately writes back, you're welcome anytime. What I didn't know was the one exception to not receiving anybody is if it's a potential vocation. So I'm still Jewish, I'm not baptized, I'm still anti-Catholic, but I get on a plane and fly to France and show up at this Carthusian monastery. And so I'm staying there, it was for about a week, and I'm staying in a cell, and the prior is coming once a day, every day in the afternoon, to ask me if I have any questions or to give me spiritual direction. And every day I'm saying to myself, I'm expecting him to give me a sales pitch about why I should become Catholic, right? So every day I'm expecting that when he shows up, today will be the day he gives me the sales pitch, but he doesn't, And then, so he goes off after we talk, and I say, well, tomorrow. He's waiting till tomorrow to give me the sales pitch, but he still doesn't. So finally, I can't take the suspense anymore, and so when he comes, that day, I kind of let him have it with both barrels, and I say, aren't you going to tell me why I should become Catholic? And he said, oh no, not at all. All I ask is that you keep your eyes open and be honest with yourself about what you see. This overwhelmed me, because obviously he had faith in the Holy Spirit, and, he knew it was the truth. Anyway, this is the last thing I was expecting excuse me for saying it, as a pushy Jew, So I'm going to tell about 3 stories that happened there, because that's really where most of my conversion took place, was at that Carthusian monastery. So that's one thing that happened. Another thing that happened was I was joining the monks every night from midnight to 2:30 in the morning in their office, it's chanting the divine office, which of course are the Psalms from the Old Testament. So I'm getting up in the middle of the night, and I'm in this little stall, next to all the monks on stalls to my left and my right, and they're chanting, "O Jerusalem, should I ever forget you, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth," and "O Zion, there's no place in the world as beautiful as you." And I'm looking around at all these old monks saying to myself, they're all wannabe Jews. And then the third thing that happened there was I'm working, my job there was to cut grass in the orchard with this old scythe. So I'm out there scything the grass one day, and this elderly monk shuffles out to me, because since they're never allowed to speak, sometimes they like to take the opportunity. And so he shuffles out to me, and he says to me, "May I ask you a question?" And I say, "Sure." And he says, "Well, if you don't mind my asking, you're not Catholic, are you?" Because they saw that I wasn't receiving communion at Mass. And I said, "No, that's right, I'm not Catholic." And then he says, "Well then, if you don't mind my asking, what are you then?" And I say very proudly, "I'm Jewish." And he said, "Oh, that's a relief. We were all afraid you were Protestant." So you can see, then I saw the view that they had, which was that Jews are, as St. John Paul II said, our elder brothers in the faith. Protestants had the faith but rejected it, but Jews were in a different category. And the third thing that happened there, and maybe the most important thing that happened there, was I felt the presence of the Blessed Virgin Mary there. I would have thought, as a materialist or whatever, that these monks would be sourpusses. They would be bitter. They would be unhappy. Here they lived this incredibly penitential life. They had no pleasures, right? They had no comfort. They had no sleep. But instead, they were joyful, like kindergartners sharing a joke. Many of them looked like they were, kind of had a secret giggle going on behind their faces. And I knew that what filled them with that love and that filled them with that warmth was the presence of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And I don't know the correct theology to describe this, but when I was there, I felt the way that the Blessed Virgin Mary animates the spirit of the Catholic Church. It's like the Catholic Church is the external building, and the Blessed Virgin Mary is the heart of it. And I felt that there. So by the time I left there, I wanted to become Catholic. It still took me a few years for various reasons. But it took me a couple of years to be baptized. Some of the places I went were a little bit confused. But anyway, and of course, that was the biggest thing in my life. And since my baptism, and please don't applaud this has nothing to do with me, but since my baptism, which was in 1992, so once I make it 22 years ago, I honestly don't think I went more than a dozen days without receiving communion, and usually when I was traveling. And the only reason is because I'm still, again, excuse me for saying this, I'm still that Harvard Business School marketing professor. I'm still greedy. And given what communion is, and given the fact that we live for all eternity, and our eternity is entirely dependent on this little period of 60 or 70 or 80 years of life on earth, and I'm not sure what we receive when we receive Holy Communion, but it's probably going to matter for all eternity.